I'm 35 and I need to get this out because what happened 3 months ago at my family's annual reunion completely changed everything, and now they won't stop contacting me and I refuse to respond to any of them. Some context first. I spent most of my 20s and early 30s struggling. I dropped out of college twice, worked random jobs that went nowhere, went through a divorce at 29 that left me broke and basically became the family disappointment. My parents, Charles and Karen, my uncle Theodore, my aunt Dolores, my sister Michelle, my cousin Justin, even my grandmother Anastasia. They all watched me fail over and over. And yeah, I knew they talked about me. I'm not stupid, but I thought there was still some basic family respect there, some line they wouldn't cross. I was wrong. The reunion was in July at my parents' place. They've got this big house with a wraparound porch, the kind of setup that makes them feel successful. I'd driven 6 hours to get there in my 2015 Toyota Camry that needed new brake pads. I was doing better by then. I'd spent the last 2 years working my way up in commercial property management, finally making decent money, finally getting my life together, but I hadn't told them much about it. Partly because I wanted to be sure it would last, partly because I was tired of their judgment about everything I did. I got there around 2 p.m. on Saturday. Everyone was already in the backyard doing the usual reunion stuff. Michelle was there with her husband. Justin brought his girlfriend. The whole extended family showed up. I made my rounds, said hello to everyone, dealt with the usual questions about my life that felt more like interrogations. My mom asked if I was seeing anyone. My dad asked about my job in that tone that suggested he didn't believe I actually had one. Theodore made some comment about hoping I could afford to chip in for Grandma Anastasia's birthday gift next month. I stayed for a few hours, ate some food, tried to have normal conversations, felt that familiar tension that always existed when I was around them. Around 5 p.m., I told everyone I needed to head out. I'd said I had to get back for work on Monday, which was true, but mainly I just wanted to leave. The whole atmosphere made me feel like I was 20 again and disappointing everyone just by existing. I went inside to use the bathroom and grabbed my jacket from the front closet. That's when I heard them. I was walking through the living room toward the front door when their voices came through the screen door from the porch. They must have moved out there thinking I'd already left. Theodore's voice came first loud and clear. He said, I wasn't really family, just their walking example of complete failure. He actually said those words. Walking example of complete failure. Then Justin started laughing. That loud, obnoxious laugh he's had since high school. He said to watch me leave empty-handed again because I probably couldn't even afford the gas to get there. Everyone laughed at that. My mom was talking to her friend Linda who'd stopped by. She said they tell people I'm finding myself, but really I'm just a 35-year-old nobody with nothing. Her exact words. Nobody with nothing. Michelle added that even my ex-wife laughs about how pathetic I turned out. I didn't even know Michelle still talked to my ex. Then my dad's voice cut through everything else. He said I was the family embarrassment, the one they don't mention in public. He sounded almost proud of that observation, like he'd been waiting to say it out loud. Dolores jumped in with this remember when he said he'd show us all still waiting, mocking me for something I'd apparently said years ago that I didn't even remember. And Grandma Anastasia, this 80-year-old woman who used to give me cookies when I was a kid, she muttered something about how she should have known I'd amount to nothing when I was born. I stood there in that living room for maybe 30 seconds. I wasn't shocked exactly, more like everything suddenly made sense. All those years of subtle digs and concerned questions and disappointed looks. This is what they actually thought. This was who they really were when I wasn't in the room. I walked out to my car. Didn't slam the door. Didn't make a scene. Just got in the Camry and drove away. I could see some of them still on the porch through my rear-view mirror. Laughing about something else probably. The 6-hour drive back gave me a lot of time to think. I wasn't sad. I was just done. Completely done. These people had spent years making me feel worthless. And I'd spent years trying to prove myself to them, trying to earn their respect. And for what? So they could stand on a porch and laugh about what a failure I was. I got home around midnight. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying what they'd said, every single word. And I started thinking about my actual situation versus what they believed my situation was. They thought I was broke and pathetic. They had no idea what I'd actually been doing for the past 2 years. See, the property management job I'd been working, I hadn't told them the full story. I wasn't just managing properties. I'd spent 2 years learning every aspect of commercial real estate, making connections, saving every dollar I could. 6 months before that reunion, I'd partnered with my boss to start acquiring small commercial properties. We'd bought 3 buildings so far. I was part owner. I had money, real money, for the first time in my life. And here's the thing that made everything click into place that night. One of those buildings we'd bought was a small office complex. My dad's company rented 2 units in that building. Theodore's business rented another unit. I'd known this when we bought it. Obviously, the previous owner had these long-term leases in place, but I hadn't really thought about the implications until I was lying in bed at midnight replaying them, calling me a failure. Their leases were up for renewal in 4 months, October 1st. I didn't do anything right away. I went to work on Monday, took care of my regular responsibilities, acted normal, but I was paying attention now. Really paying attention. I started looking at every connection my family had to my world. Every place where our lives intersected in ways they didn't realize. Michelle worked as a freelance graphic designer. Guess who she did regular contract work for? One of my business partner's other properties, a marketing firm that rented from us. I'd never connected the dots before. Justin's girlfriend worked at a small accounting firm. They rented an office suite from us, too. It was like I'd been walking around blind, and suddenly I could see all these threads connecting their lives to mine. These pressure points they had no idea existed. The next few weeks were interesting. They kept texting me like nothing had happened. My mom sent her usual check-in messages asking about work and if I was eating properly. My dad forwarded me some article about time. Sounds good for the birthday. I wanted them comfortable. I wanted them to think everything was normal, that I had no idea what they'd said, that I was still the same disappointing failure trying to stay connected to the family. August passed. I went to Grandma's birthday party in early September. Smiled, made small talk, gave her a nice gift. Everyone commented on how good it was to see me making an effort with the family. Theodore made another joke about me probably needing to borrow money to afford the gift. I laughed it off. I started having conversations with my business partner about our properties and the upcoming lease renewals. We had decisions to make. The market had changed. We could charge more rent now, or we could decide not to renew certain leases at all if we thought the spaces could be better utilized. Michelle sent me a text in mid-September asking if I could put in a good word for her with some of my contacts because she was trying to expand her client base. She had no idea that I was connected to one of her main clients. I told her I'd see what I could do. My dad called me in late September. He wanted to know if I'd be at Thanksgiving. He said it would mean a lot to the family if I made the effort to be there. He used that phrase, make the effort, like I was the one who needed to try harder to be part of this family. I told him I'd be there. September 30th, I had a meeting with my business partner. We went over all the lease renewals coming up. He asked about my dad and uncle's businesses. He knew they were tenants. Obviously, he wanted to know if I wanted to handle those renewals differently because of the family connection. I said, no special treatment. We should handle them like any other tenants. If they want to renew, they need to pay market rate, and we should probably give them notice that we're considering other options for those spaces anyway. He looked at me for a minute, then he nodded. October 1st was a Tuesday. The lease renewal notices went out that morning to all our tenants whose leases were expiring. Standard business practice. 60 days notice that their leases were ending. Here are the terms. If they want to renew at current market rates, please respond within 30 days if they're interested. My dad's company got their notice. Theodore's business got their notice. Michelle's client at the marketing firm got their notice. Justin's girlfriend's accounting firm got their notice. The new rates were significantly higher. Market rate for the area completely justified. Nothing illegal or unreasonable. Just business. I knew they'd see those notices. I knew they'd do the math and realize they couldn't afford the new rates, or they'd have to make significant cuts to their businesses to manage it. I knew they'd panic, but I didn't expect them to connect it back to me. Not yet. Why would they? As far as they knew, I was just their failure nephew, a son-B brother who worked some job in property management. They had no idea I owned the buildings they were renting from. I went about my normal routine. Work, gym, home. I ignored the first few calls from my dad. I figured he wanted to talk about Thanksgiving again. Then October 15th happened. I woke up at 3 a.m. to my phone absolutely blowing up. Calls, texts, voicemails, everyone in my family trying to reach me all at once. Apparently, someone had finally connected the dots. I'm still not sure who figured it out first, but by 3 a.m. they all knew. They knew I owned the buildings. They knew I was behind the lease renewals. They knew I'd been sitting on this information for months while smiling at family gatherings and pretending everything was fine. The voicemails were frantic. My dad saying we needed to talk immediately. There had to be some misunderstanding. Theodore demanding I call him back right now and explain what I thought I was doing. Michelle crying about how this was going to destroy her relationship with her biggest client. Justin's voicemail wasn't even coherent, just angry yelling. My mom's text said I was being cruel and this wasn't how family treats each other. I read every message, listened to every voicemail, then I put my phone on silent and went back to sleep. When I woke up at 7 a.m., there were 43 more notifications. Update 1. All right, so a lot of you in the comments asked what happened next and whether I responded to any of them. The answer is yes, I did respond, but not the way they expected. That first morning after the 3 o'clock a.m. call avalanche, I let them sweat until around 10 a.m. Then I sent a group text to the family chat. Yeah, we had a family group chat that I'd been muted in for months, and I kept it simple. I told them I was available to discuss the lease renewals during normal business hours through proper channels, and they should contact my business partner's office to schedule meetings about their rental agreements. My mom responded within seconds asking why I was being so cold about this, saying this was a family matter and we needed to talk as family. My dad said I was being ridiculous and to call him immediately. Theodore sent a message saying I had no right to ambush them like this, and if I had issues with the family, I should have brought them up like an adult instead of pulling the stunt. That word stunt really got to me, like I was the one being unreasonable here. I didn't respond to the group chat again. Instead, over the next few days, I did exactly what I said I'd do. My dad called my business partner's office and scheduled a meeting for that Friday. Theodore did the same. Michelle tried calling me directly about 17 times before finally accepting that I wasn't going to answer and reaching out through the proper business channels about her client's lease situation. The first meeting was with my dad on Friday afternoon. He showed up at our office with his business accountant. Professional, prepared. That's how Charles operates. Even when he's panicking, he maintains that corporate competence he's so proud of. We sat in the conference room. My business partner handled most of the discussion, initially going over the new lease terms, the market analysis showing why the rates had increased, the timeline for their decision. My dad listened, asked questions about the numbers, tried to negotiate on the rates. Standard business meeting. Then he turned to me and his whole demeanor changed. He said we needed to talk privately, that this wasn't just about business, and I knew it. My business partner excused himself, probably sensing this was about to get personal. Once we were alone, my dad started in on how disappointed he was that I'd let things get to this point. He said, if I had problems with the family, I should have come to him directly instead of using my position to hurt everyone financially. He actually used the phrase using my position like I'd somehow acquired these properties specifically to trap them instead of the reality, which was that they happened to be renting from buildings I owned. I asked him if he remembered the reunion in July. He said of course he remembered. It was a nice family gathering and he'd been glad to see me making an effort to stay connected. I asked him if he remembered what happened after I left. He got this confused look and said I'd left around 5 p.m. and that was the last he saw of me that day. So, I told him word for word as much as I could remember. What Theodore said about me being their walking example of complete failure. What Justin said about me leaving empty-handed because I couldn't afford gas. What Michelle said about my ex-wife laughing at how pathetic I am. What my mom said about me being a nobody with nothing. What he said about me being the family embarrassment they don't mention in public. I watched his face while I recounted all of it. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for almost a full minute. Then he said that conversations taken out of context can sound worse than they were meant, and that I was being overly sensitive about family members venting frustrations to each other. He said everyone complains about their relatives sometimes, and I was turning normal family dynamics into some kind of personal attack. I asked him which part was taken out of context. The part where he called me an embarrassment, or the part where Grandma said she should have known I'd amount to nothing when I was born. He got defensive, then started explaining how it had been frustrating for them to watch me struggle for so many years, how they'd tried to help me and I'd rejected their advice, how I'd made choices that hurt myself and by extension hurt them because they cared about me. He said they had a right to feel frustrated, that I'd put them through a lot of worry and disappointment. And if I'd overheard them expressing that frustration, then maybe I needed to consider why they felt that way instead of acting like I was some kind of victim. That's when it really clicked for me. He genuinely believed their behavior was justified. In his mind, my years of struggling gave them the right to mock me, to laugh at my failures, to call me an embarrassment because they'd been worried, because I disappointed them. I told him the new lease terms were non-negotiable. Market rate, take it or leave it. He had until November 1st to decide whether to renew. He stood up and said I was making a huge mistake, that family was more important than whatever grudge I was holding, and that this was going to damage relationships permanently. I told him those relationships were already damaged. I'd just been the only one who didn't know it. He left, didn't slam the door or anything dramatic, just walked out looking frustrated and tired. Theodore's meeting was Monday morning. He came in alone, no accountant, and he was already angry before we even started. He sat down and immediately launched into how I'd always been sensitive and dramatic about everything, how I took things too personally, and how this whole situation proved that I still hadn't grown up. He said the family had always walked on eggshells around me because I couldn't handle honest feedback, and now I was punishing everyone because I'd overheard a private conversation that wasn't meant for my ears. My business partner tried to steer the conversation back to the lease terms, but Theodore wasn't interested. He kept going, saying I'd always played the victim, always blamed everyone else for my problems, and that maybe if I'd listened to the family's concerns over the years instead of being defensive, I wouldn't have spent my 20s and 30s failing at everything I tried. I asked him why he thought I'd failed at everything. He listed it out. Dropped out of college twice, couldn't hold down a steady job, got divorced, moved back home in my late 20s. He said these were objective facts, not opinions, and the family had tried to be supportive, but there was only so much support you could give someone who refused to help themselves. I asked him if he knew what I did for a living now. He said something vague about property management, clearly not really knowing or caring about the details. So, I explained the 2 years I'd spent learning the business, the connections I'd made, the properties I'd acquired. I pulled up the portfolio on my laptop and showed him. 3 commercial buildings, 2 residential complexes, several ongoing projects. He looked at the numbers. Then he said that this just proved his point. I'd finally gotten my act together, so why was I now trying to tear the family apart instead of being grateful for their support during my difficult years? The logic was actually impressive in its circularity. When I was struggling, they were justified in mocking me because I was failing. Now that I was successful, I should be grateful to them for putting up with me when I was failing. There was no scenario in his mind where their behavior had been wrong. I told him the same thing I'd told my dad. Market rate non-negotiable. Decision by November 1st. He said I was going to regret this, that I was burning bridges I'd eventually need, that family was permanent and business was temporary. Then he left. Michelle showed up Wednesday. No appointment. Just appeared at the office around lunchtime. The receptionist called back and asked if I'd see her, and I said yes because I was curious what approach she'd take. She came into my office crying, not dramatic sobbing, just tears running down her face while she talked. She said she didn't understand why I was doing this, that she'd always tried to be a good sister to me, and that destroying her client relationship was going to seriously damage her income. She said she had bills to pay, a mortgage, a life she'd built. And I was threatening all of it because of something she'd said at a family gathering. I reminded her what she'd said, that even my ex-wife laughs about how pathetic I turned out. She said she didn't remember saying that, but if she did, she was probably just joking around and I'd misunderstood the tone. She said the family does that, makes jokes about each other, and it doesn't mean anything serious. Then she said that even if she had said something hurtful, this punishment didn't fit the crime, and I was being vindictive and cruel in a way that wasn't like me. I asked her when exactly she'd talked to my ex-wife about me. She got quiet and said they'd run into each other at a coffee shop a few months ago and chatted briefly. I asked what my ex had said that was so funny about how pathetic I turned out. Michelle said she couldn't remember the exact conversation, that it was just small talk and I was reading way too much into a casual comment, but her face told me she remembered just fine. I explained that I wasn't destroying her client relationship. I was a property owner making standard business decisions about my buildings. Her client could choose to renew at the market rate or find another location. That was business, not personal. She switched tactics. Then started talking about how we'd been close as kids, how she'd looked up to me, how she'd always defended me to the family when others were being too harsh. She said she knew I'd had a hard time over the years, but she'd always believed in me, and now I was throwing away our sibling relationship over one misunderstood comment. The interesting thing about Michelle is that she probably actually believes this version of history. She's rewritten the past in her mind, where she was the supportive sister and I was the struggling brother she defended. Never mind that she'd participated in mocking me just like everyone else. In her version, she was always on my side. I told her the lease terms weren't changing. She left without saying goodbye. Over the next week, the calls and messages continued, but with a different tone, less panic, more strategy. My mom sent long texts about family loyalty and forgiveness and how everyone makes mistakes. Theodore tried to go around me and negotiate directly with my business partner, who shut that down immediately. Justin's girlfriend apparently quit her job at the accounting firm rather than deal with the stress of the possible lease non-renewal, which I only heard about through my mom's text saying I'd cost a young woman her job. My dad tried a different approach. He showed up at my apartment on a Saturday morning with coffee and bagels. Said he wanted to talk father to son, not business to business. I let him in because honestly I was curious how far he'd take this. We sat at my kitchen table and he did this whole speech about how he'd been thinking a lot about what I'd said. And he understood now that their words had hurt me more than they'd realized. He said they'd all been concerned about me for so long that it became a habit to focus on my problems. And somewhere along the way they'd stopped seeing my successes. He acknowledged that the things they'd said at the reunion were hurtful. And he was sorry I'd heard them. Notice the phrasing. Sorry I'd heard them. Not sorry they'd said them. I asked him if he thought the things they'd said were true. He did this pause and said that at the time, based on what they knew about my situation, they'd been expressing legitimate frustrations, but now that they knew more about what I'd accomplished, they could see they'd been wrong about where I was in life. So basically, they'd been right to mock me when they thought I was failing. But now that they knew I was successful, they were willing to revise their assessment. I asked him what he wanted from this conversation. He said he wanted us to work this out as a family to find a compromise where everyone's needs were met. He suggested maybe I could use my position as part owner to advocate for reasonable lease terms for family members, treat them as preferred tenants, maybe even give them a family discount. A family discount for people who'd called me a family embarrassment. I told him I'd think about it and he left looking hopeful. I didn't think about it. November 1st was getting closer. None of them had agreed to the new lease terms yet. They were all still holding out, probably hoping I'd cave. That family pressure or guilt or some lingering need for their approval would make me back down. What they didn't know, what I hadn't told any of them yet, was that we already had other tenants lined up for those spaces if the current leases weren't renewed. High-up paying tenants who'd been on a waiting list for months. The deadline was 8 days away when Grandma Anastasia called me. Update 2. So, Grandma Anastasia called me. For those who asked in the comments, yes, she's the same woman who said she should have known I'd amount to nothing when I was born. 80 years old, sharp as ever, and apparently designated as the family's secret weapon. She didn't call at 3 a.m. like the others. She called at 7 p.m. on a Thursday, which is when she always used to call me when I was younger, right after dinner when she'd settled into her armchair with her evening tea. The familiarity of the timing wasn't accidental. She started with small talk, asked how I was doing, commented on the weather, mentioned she'd been watching some show on television, just normal grandma conversation. Then she said she'd heard that there was some tension in the family and she wanted to understand my side of things because everyone seemed very upset, but no one was explaining it clearly to her. The thing about Anastasia is that she's not senile or confused. She knew exactly what was happening, but she was playing the concerned elderly grandmother who just wants her family to get along, and she's very good at that role. I asked her if she remembered what she said at the reunion. She got quiet for a moment, then said she was an old woman who sometimes spoke without thinking, and if she'd said something hurtful, she truly didn't remember it. But she was sorry if her words had caused me pain. Notice she didn't deny saying it. She just claimed not to remember, which gave her deniability while sort of acknowledging it might have happened. She went on about how family was the most important thing in life. How when you got to be her age, you realized that grudges and hurt feelings didn't matter as much as having your loved ones around you. She said she'd watched too many families tear apart over small misunderstandings that could have been resolved with forgiveness and communication. Small misunderstandings. That's what she called it. I asked her if she thought what they'd said about me was a small misunderstanding. She said that people sometimes say things in frustration that they don't really mean, and it's important to look at the intent behind the words rather than the words themselves. She said the family had been worried about me for years, watching me struggle, wanting to help but not knowing how. She said that worry sometimes came out as criticism or harsh words, but it came from a place of love. I've heard this argument from every single one of them now. They were worried, so their cruelty was actually love. They were frustrated, so their mockery was justified. They cared about me, so calling me a failure and an embarrassment was somehow an act of concern. Anastasia kept going. She talked about how Charles and Karen had supported me financially during my divorce. How Theodore had offered me jobs over the years that I had turned down. How Michelle had always included me in family events even when I was difficult to be around. She was rewriting history in real time, painting them as patient saints and me as the ungrateful recipient of their endless generosity. The jobs Theodore offered me were low-level positions at his company that would have kept me dependent on him. The financial support from my parents came with constant reminders of how much I owed them. Michelle's invitations to family events always felt like pity invites. But in Anastasia's version, these were acts of pure familial love that I was now repaying with vindictiveness. She said she understood I was hurt, but that this business situation I'd created was going to cause real harm to people I'd known my whole life. She said Theodore's business was already struggling with increased costs, and losing his office space or having to pay significantly more rent might force him to lay off employees. She said my dad's company was at a critical growth stage and this disruption could set them back years. She said Michelle had worked hard to build her client base and losing a major client would devastate her financially. I asked her if any of them had considered how their words might cause real harm to me when they were laughing about what a pathetic failure I was. She said that was different because words could be apologized for and forgiven, but business decisions had permanent consequences. The logic was fascinating. Their words, which had cut deep enough to change how I saw my entire family, were just words easily dismissed. But my business decisions, completely standard and legal, were unforgivable acts that would cause permanent damage. She tried a few more angles. She mentioned my mom's blood pressure had been dangerously high from the stress. She said Justin was talking about moving out of state because he couldn't handle the family drama. She brought up Thanksgiving and how sad it would be if the family couldn't gather together this year because of all this tension. When none of that worked, she shifted again. She said she'd been thinking about changing her will, that she'd planned to leave me a portion of her estate, but now she wasn't sure if that was wise given how I was treating the family. She said she'd always thought I'd be the one to take care of her legacy, but maybe she'd been wrong about my character. There it was, the threat. Be a good grandson and fall in line or lose your inheritance. I told her the new lease terms were market rate and non-negotiable. She got quiet again, then said she'd tried to reach me as family, and she was disappointed I'd chosen money over relationships. She said she hoped I'd reconsider before it was too late, and that she loved me, even if I didn't believe it right now. Then she hung up. The next day, my mom showed up at my office. No appointment, just walked right past reception because apparently being my mother gave her special access privileges in her mind. My receptionist buzzed me looking apologetic and I told her to send Karen back. My mom came in looking exhausted. She sat down and immediately started talking about how this whole situation was tearing her apart, watching her son and her husband at odds with each other. Seeing the family fracture. She said she'd been caught in the middle trying to understand both sides, but she needed me to explain what I wanted as an end result here because she couldn't see how this resolved in any way that didn't leave everyone damaged. I asked her what she wanted me to explain. She said she wanted to understand my thought process, what I was hoping to accomplish, whether I'd thought through the long-term consequences of my actions. So, I laid it out for her. I told her that for years I'd struggled with feeling inadequate around the family, like nothing I did was ever good enough. I'd thought it was just my own insecurity, my own perception. Then I'd heard them at the reunion and realized it wasn't in my head. They really did see me as a failure and an embarrassment. They really did mock me behind my back. She tried to interrupt, but I kept going. I told her that every interaction since then felt like a lie. Every text asking how I was doing, every invitation to family events, every piece of advice they offered, it was all contaminated by knowing what they actually thought of me. I said I couldn't unhear what they'd said, and I couldn't pretend we were a normal, loving family anymore. Karen said that every family has moments where people vent or say things they don't mean, and I was taking one conversation out of context and using it to destroy years of relationships. She said if I'd confronted them about it right away instead of hiding what I'd heard and plotting this revenge, maybe it could have been worked through. I asked her if she remembered what she'd said, that I was a nobody with nothing, that they told people I was finding myself, but really I was just a 35-year-old disappointment. She got defensive. She said she'd been having a private conversation with her friend Linda, venting frustrations after years of watching me struggle and not knowing how to help. She said, "Parents are allowed to feel frustrated with their children sometimes." And I was acting like she'd committed some unforgivable crime by having one moment of honesty with a friend. One moment of honesty. That's what hurt the most. Because she was admitting that what she'd said was true. Her honest assessment of me, not something said in anger or without thinking, but her real feelings that she'd been polite enough to hide from me until that moment. I pointed this out to her. She got quiet, then said that at the time, based on what she knew about my life, she'd felt that way, but she'd been wrong. And now that she understood my actual situation, she could see she'd misjudged me. She said she was apologizing for being wrong and asking for a chance to rebuild our relationship. I asked her why she thought I'd struggled for so many years. She said I'd made poor choices, dropped out of school twice, married someone who wasn't right for me, refused to take advice from people who had more life experience. Standard mom answers. I told her that a lot of my poor choices came from trying to live up to impossible expectations. That I dropped out of college the first time because I was studying what Charles wanted me to study, not what I cared about. That I dropped out the second time because I was so depressed from feeling like a failure. That I couldn't function. That my marriage had fallen apart partly because my ex got tired of my family treating me like a charity case they were generously supporting. Karen looked genuinely surprised by this. She said she'd never known I felt that much pressure from them, that they'd only wanted what was best for me. I asked her how calling me an embarrassment was. Wanting what's best for me. She didn't have an answer for that. We talked for almost an hour. She tried every argument. Family loyalty, forgiveness, practical concerns about the business impacts, emotional appeals about how much she loved me. She cried at one point. She got angry at another point, saying I was being stubborn and spiteful and that I'd regret losing my family over this. But underlying everything was this assumption that I was the one who needed to fix this. I was the one who needed to forgive, to compromise, to sacrifice my boundaries for the sake of family harmony. Never once did she suggest that maybe they needed to actually address their behavior beyond surface-level apologies. I told her the same thing I'd told everyone else. Market rate, non-negotiable, November 1st deadline. She left looking defeated. Theodore tried a different approach. He sent an email, formal, businesslike, laying out a detailed proposal. He'd accept the new lease rate if I'd agreed to a 5-year term with a cap on annual increases, plus first right of refusal if I ever decided to sell the building. Basically trying to lock in protection for himself long term. I forwarded the email to my business partner without comment. He responded saying, "Absolutely not. We don't give special terms to anyone, and especially not to someone who's trying to leverage family relationships for business advantages." Justin sent me a Facebook message. He said he'd never really been close with me, but he thought what I was doing was messed up and that I needed to grow up and stop acting like a victim. He said everyone gets insulted by their family sometimes, and most people don't throw a tantrum and try to destroy everyone's lives over it. He said his girlfriend had quit her job because of the stress I'd caused, and he hoped I was happy with myself. The thing about Justin is that he's never liked me. We're only a year apart in age, and growing up there was this constant comparison between us. He was the successful cousin. Good grades, college degree, steady job right out of school. I was the one who struggled. So, he'd grown up seeing me as the family's cautionary tale. The example of what happens when you don't apply yourself. His message basically confirmed that he saw me the same way everyone else did. The difference was he felt entitled to say it to my face instead of behind my back. I didn't respond to him. Michelle tried one more time. She came to my apartment on Sunday morning, brought bagels like my dad had, said she wanted to talk sister to sister. I let her in because I was curious if she'd try a new angle or just repeat the same arguments. She asked me straight out what it would take to fix this. What did I want from them? What needed to happen for me to change my mind about the leases? I thought about it for a minute because it was actually a fair question. What did I want? An apology. I'd gotten those shallow as they were. An acknowledgement that they'd hurt me. They'd sort of admitted that while qualifying it with explanations about context and intent. A promise to treat me better going forward that felt meaningless when the only reason they wanted to treat me better now was because I had something they needed. I told Michelle that I didn't think there was anything they could do to fix it. Because the core problem wasn't what they'd said at the reunion. It was that they'd thought those things about me for years. And the only reason they were apologizing now was because I'd turned out to have power over something they wanted. If I'd stayed broke and struggling, they'd still be laughing about what a failure I was. She said that wasn't fair, that people change their minds about people all the time based on new information. She said I'd shown them a different side of myself by building this business success, and they were allowed to revise their opinions based on that new information. But that was exactly the problem. Their respect for me was conditional on my success, which meant it wasn't really respect at all. We argued about it for a while. She got emotional again, said I was being impossible to reach, that I'd built this wall around myself and wouldn't let anyone through. She said I was so focused on being right and being the victim that I couldn't see how much damage I was causing. I asked her to leave. She did, but not before saying that November 1st was 2 days away, and I still had time to change my mind, and she hoped for everyone's sake that I'd reconsider. November 1st was Monday. The deadline for lease renewals. None of them had signed. Final update. November 1st came and went. None of them signed the lease renewals. I got calls starting at 8 a.m. My dad first saying he needed one more day to review the terms with his accountant. Theodore at 9 a.m. saying the deadline was arbitrary and unreasonable. Michelle at 10 a.m. crying about how I was really going to do this. My mom at noon asking if we could please sit down as a family and work this out before it was too late. I responded to all of them the same way. The deadline had passed. The leases were terminated. They had 30 days to vacate the premises per the terms of their original agreements. By 2 p.m., my phone was ringing constantly. I stopped answering and just let the voicemails pile up. By the end of the day, I had 63 missed calls and 41 text messages. The new tenants we'd lined up were ready to move in December 1st. Higher rent, longer lease terms, better credit, standard business transition. What I wasn't expecting was for them to show up at my apartment that night. All of them. Charles, Karen, Theodore, Dolores, Michelle, even Justin and his girlfriend. They'd coordinated this. Planned it out like some kind of intervention. I opened the door and they were standing in my hallway. My dad started talking immediately, saying they needed to have a family meeting and work this out face to face. I told him I wasn't interested in a meeting and started to close the door. Theodore put his hand on the door. He said they weren't leaving until I listened to what they had to say. I told him to move his hand or I'd call building security. He moved it, but they all stayed there in the hallway. My mom started talking about how this had gone too far, how we were all saying and doing things we'd regret, and how we needed to find a path forward before permanent damage was done. Michelle said I was being unreasonable and cruel and she couldn't believe I was actually going through with this. Justin said I was acting like a child throwing a tantrum. I asked them what they thought was going to happen here. Did they think showing up at my apartment as a group was going to intimidate me into changing my mind? Did they think I'd suddenly feel guilty and cave? Charles said they wanted me to understand the real-world consequences of my decisions. He started laying out the financial impact on each of them. Theodore would have to lay off 3 employees and move his business to a smaller location outside the city. My dad's company would lose their main office and have to operate remotely, which would damage their ability to attract new clients. Michelle's client was already looking for a new designer because they couldn't afford to keep her on if they had to relocate. Justin's girlfriend had quit her job, and they were struggling to cover rent on just his income. I asked him if he'd considered the real-world consequences of calling me a family embarrassment, if he'd thought about the impact of years of treating me like a failure and a disappointment. He said that comparing hurt feelings to actual financial devastation was ridiculous. He said, "Feelings heal, but business losses can destroy lives." He said I was being vindictive and petty in a way that was going to have lasting consequences for multiple families. Theodore jumped in saying I'd always been like this, overly sensitive and unable to let things go. He said I'd spent my whole life playing victim and now I finally had some power and I was using it to punish people for being honest about my failures. That word again, honest. Like their cruelty was some kind of virtue. Dolores started talking about how family was supposed to forgive each other. How we all make mistakes and say things we don't mean, and how I was holding one bad moment over everyone's heads forever. She said they'd all apologized multiple times and I refused to accept it, which meant I didn't actually want reconciliation. I just wanted revenge. She was right about that last part. I did want them to face consequences. I wanted them to understand what it felt like to be dismissed and diminished and treated like you don't matter. Michelle tried a different approach. She said she understood I was hurt and I had every right to be angry, but that destroying their lives wasn't going to make me feel better. She said revenge might feel satisfying in the moment, but it would leave me isolated and alone. That I'd lose my entire family over this, and eventually I'd regret it. I told her I'd already lost my family. I'd lost them the moment I heard what they really thought of me. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accepting reality. The reality was that they didn't respect me. They didn't value me. And the only reason they wanted me in their lives now was because I had something they needed. Karen started crying. She said that wasn't true. That they loved me and always had, and that I was twisting everything to fit this narrative where I was the victim and they were the villains. She said families were complicated and messy and people said hurtful things sometimes. But that didn't erase years of love and support and shared history. I asked her what support she was referring to. The financial help during my divorce that came with constant reminders of my failure. The job offers from Theodore that would have kept me dependent on him. The family gatherings where I was the butt of every joke. Theodore got angry at that. He said I was rewriting history, that they'd tried to help me over and over and I'd rejected everything because I was stubborn and proud. He said the job offers were legitimate opportunities and I'd turned them down because I couldn't handle taking direction from family. He said the financial help was generous and I should have been grateful instead of resentful. We stood there in my hallway arguing for over an hour. They tried every angle. Guilt, anger, logic, emotional appeals. They brought up childhood memories, talked about shared experiences, reminded me of times they'd been there for me. They painted this picture of a loving family being torn apart by one person's inability to forgive. But underlying every argument was the same assumption, that I was wrong, that my hurt wasn't valid, that I needed to be the one to compromise and forgive and sacrifice for the sake of family unity. Never once did any of them actually address the core issue, which was that they'd spent years viewing me with contempt and only changed their tune when it became financially inconvenient not to. Finally, I told them they needed to leave. Charles said we weren't finished talking. I said yes, we were, and if they didn't leave, I was calling security. He looked at the others like he expected them to refuse to stand their ground. But one by one, they started moving toward the elevator. Michelle was the last to leave. She stood there looking at me and said she hoped I'd change my mind before December 1st because after that the damage would be irreversible. I closed the door. The next few weeks were intense. They tried everything. My mom sent me long emails about family bonds and forgiveness. Theodore threatened legal action claiming I was using my position to discriminate against them, though his lawyer apparently told him he had no case. Michelle started a group chat with extended family members who then started contacting me asking me to reconsider. My cousin on my mom's side called saying she'd heard about the situation and couldn't believe I was being so heartless. Apparently, the family narrative was that I'd overheard one mildly critical conversation and was now trying to destroy everyone over it. They'd completely reframed the story to make themselves look like victims of my overreaction. I sent her screenshots. The text from my mom calling me a nobody with nothing. The voicemail from Theodore talking about what a failure I was. The email from Michelle discussing how pathetic my ex-wife thought I was. I sent all the evidence I'd been quietly collecting over the past months. She stopped responding after that. Thanksgiving came and went. I wasn't invited to the family gathering, which was fine because I wouldn't have gone anyway. My mom sent a text saying it was the first Thanksgiving in 20 years where the whole family wasn't together, and it broke her heart. I didn't respond. December 1st arrived. The old tenants moved out. The new tenants moved in. It was just a normal business transition. My dad's company relocated to a co-working space 30 minutes outside the city. Theodore laid off 2 of his 3 employees and moved his business into his basement. Michelle lost her biggest client and had to pick up work wherever she could find it. Justin and his girlfriend moved to a cheaper apartment. The financial pressure was real, exactly what I'd intended. They were facing actual consequences for their behavior. Maybe for the first time in their lives. My dad tried one last time in mid-December. He showed up at my office, got past reception by claiming to be a client, and sat down across from my desk. He said he'd been thinking a lot about everything that had happened, and he understood now that they'd hurt me more deeply than he'd realized. He said he was truly sorry for the pain they'd caused, and he wanted to find a way to rebuild our relationship, even if the business situation couldn't be changed. I asked him what had changed. Why was he sorry now when he hadn't been sorry before? He said that seeing the actual consequences of losing me from their lives had made him realize how much he'd taken our relationship for granted. He said he'd been wrong to minimize my feelings, wrong to prioritize his ego over my well-being, wrong to treat me like a disappointment instead of appreciating who I was. It was a good speech, probably rehearsed, but it was still conditional. He was sorry now because he'd lost something, not because he genuinely understood why his behavior had been wrong. I told him I appreciated the apology, but it didn't change anything. He sat there for a minute, then left. I got a text from Anastasia in late December. She said she'd decided to split my portion of her estate among the other grandchildren since I'd chosen to distance myself from the family. She said she'd always loved me, but she couldn't reward the kind of behavior I displayed. I didn't respond to that either. Christmas came and went. I spent it alone, which was actually peaceful. No forced conversations, no walking on eggshells, no feeling like I had to prove myself or defend my choices. Michelle sent me a message on New Year's Eve. She said she'd spent months being angry at me, but she'd finally accepted that I wasn't going to change my mind, and she wanted to at least clear the air between us. She said she understood why I'd done what I did, even if she didn't agree with it. And she hoped someday we could have some kind of relationship again. I appreciated that she'd stopped trying to convince me I was wrong, but I didn't respond. It's been 3 months since the lease ended. The phone calls have mostly stopped. The desperate texts have tapered off. My business is doing well. We're acquiring 2 more properties this quarter. I'm financially stable for the first time in my life. And I'm done with them. Completely done. Not because I'm still angry. The anger has faded into something more like indifference. But because I finally understand that the family I thought I had never really existed. What I had was a group of people who tolerated me when I was struggling and only valued me when I became useful. Someone in the comments on my first post asked if I thought this was worth losing my family over. The answer is yes, because you can't lose something you never really had. They called me a walking example of complete failure. Said I'd amount to nothing. Called me a family embarrassment. Well, this nobody with nothing just changed all their lives in a way they'll never forget. I heard my entire family mock me at that reunion. Now they understand exactly what kind of person I've become. Someone who doesn't need their approval, doesn't want their fake apologies, and won't ever give them the power to make me feel worthless.